This week, a Malian jihadist pleaded guilty to war crimes for his part in destroying historic sites in Timbuktu in 2012. At the time of the attacks, he declared the buildings offensive and forbidden under Islam. It was one of many attacks on antiquities by Islamist groups in recent years, attacks that have sparked outrage in the West. But Toronto novelist Russell Smith says North Americans should check that outrage and consider our own hypocrisy when it comes to cultural cleansing. He says that rather than hide the unseemly parts of our cultural past, we should learn from them. And Russell Smith joins me now from Toronto. Hello.
Hi there.
Now, I think a lot of people will hear that and think that's a bit of a leap to link our kind of uneasy relationship with elements of our past to the destruction of art and architecture by religious extremists. Can you explain your thinking?
Well, we destroy art all the time when it's offensive. I mean, people throughout history have. Whenever a dictator is eliminated, we tear down the statue. We remember seeing the joyous tearing down of statues of Saddam Hussein after he fell in Iraq. We rename streets named after dictators after the dictators fall. We change elements of our history all the time. But at the same time, we're often so concerned about people's sensitivities and giving offense. And this is an admirable Canadian trait, of course, that we're concerned about giving offense, something we're really proud of when we go abroad. That there is a tendency to worry about public art and to consider whether we should take it down. There have been incidents in the United States of vandalism of art that's been deemed offensive. Let me give you one example. Recently, at Yale University, there was a college residence named after John Calhoun, who was an advocate of slavery. Mm-hmm. It's called Calhoun Hall. There were stained glass images representing his life. One of them showed an image of two African Americans in 19th century garb carrying bales of cotton on their head. And a guy who'd worked there for many years as a dishwasher, who was an African American himself, took offense at this, looking at it every day and being reminded of this history, and he smashed it with a broom. And that piece of stained glass is irrevocably destroyed. He was fired, and he did apologize. But one of the reasons that he was angry was that the college had refused to change the name of this hall, Calhoun Hall, in an effort to preserve the history and address, as they said, address the legacy of slavery. So that man is either an anti-racist hero or a vandal, depending on your political stripe. We have big pushes to remove certain statues and murals in Canada. I'll give you another example. Comes from Halifax. Edward Cornwallis, the founder of Halifax, a British general. There's a statue of him in Halifax that was erected in the 1930s to his glory. But of course, his historical record is not great. When he first came to Halifax, he was at war with the Mi'kmaq people and put out a bounty on Mi'kmaq scalps. So he's a representative of brutality against the First Nations. And there have been calls to remove that statue. We have a choice with these things. We can remove it to prevent offense, and I completely understand why a glorification of this brutal history causes offense. But we can put them in museums, we can contextualize them, we can add explanatory notes to them. And that's what I think is generally the reasonable middle Canadian ground. In Hungary, in Budapest, there is a theme park filled with giant statues of communist dictators, of Lenin and Stalin, which, of course, everyone wanted to pull down after the end of communism. But they have some artistic interest, and so they decided to keep them but move them into a different context. I think that would be a valid approach for a statue like Edward Cornwallis's. On the other hand, there are lots of places in Halifax named after him. There's a street, there's a park, there was a junior high that was renamed. I don't know if you want to eliminate all traces of Halifax's colonialist past. It is a colonial center. That is the past. It happened. One can't avoid it. So there's an argument to be made for leaving the statue where it is.
And you hear these kinds of things right across the country. I mean, here in Calgary, we have a bridge, the Langevin Bridge, named after one of the architects of the residential school system. The Langevin Block in Ottawa, where Justin Trudeau's office is located, is named after the same guy. Right. And there are a lot of calls to change the name, but no one's arguing, at least as far as I know, to blow up the Langevin Bridge or the Langevin Block in Ottawa? Isn't there a fundamental difference there?
You're right. No, nobody's demanding to blow anything up, and also nobody's demanding to blow up any places of worship, which is what the Taliban does with temples. So you're right. I mean, I'm making an extreme comparison just to make a point about certain parallels, but they're not ironclad. They're not ironclad parallels for sure. People certainly do demand, though, the complete elimination and obliteration of the statue of Edward Cornwallis. I've been at president universities when 19th century murals that depict women in outdated modes, their complete removal has been demanded. So certainly there is a trend to say we can't have evidence of the previously offensive in our midst.
So what are the benefits of preserving a historic monument or a building named after someone whose ideas and policies we would now find offensive? What are the benefits of preserving that, regardless of how ugly that past was?
Right. In the case of a sculpture, I think it's obvious that there's an aesthetic component. A sculpture is a piece of art. And one of the reasons that people are so outraged at the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is that they destroy beautiful objects. They destroy beautiful architecture that we deem culturally valuable. And the statue of Cornwallis, even a statue of Samuel Champlain and a First Nations guide that caused offense in Ottawa in the 1990s, that showed the First Nations guide in a subservient position and physically smaller than the European explorer. People demanded its removal. The thing is, these things have an aesthetic component that is historically and culturally interesting. They're made in they're techniques that are no longer very commonly used. And so they do have a valuable aesthetic component. We don't want to remove ornate, carefully worked, handmade representations of our past from around our midst, because then we'll end up with a bland surroundings. Now, what they did in the case of the Champlain statue in Ottawa was, again, what I think is a clever Canadian compromise. They separated the First Nations guide who was kneeling and the standing European explorer, and they just put them in two different places. And there has been a move since to try to name the guide, who was, of course, nameless. Champlain had a name, and the guide had no name, and there have been moves to try to give him a name as well. So we can reappropriate the past that was offensive without destroying it.
Now, conceivably, as we've discussed, pretty well every